Phil, would you like to lead us in a brief prayer?
Sure.
Be great.
Lord God, we've gathered together in your name today, knowing that you're with us if two or three are here. We are thankful for those who deeply desire to know you better. We thank you for this time that we can look at the Jesus part in the studies that we do. I thank you for this time to learn more. May we all be blessed in this time. Bless Merritt, especially as he shares with us. May his words be your words. In the name of Jesus, I pray. Amen.
Amen.
Man.
Oh, thanks, Phil.
Well, Merritt Horn has been reading the Urantia book since 1968. He was co-founder of the Boulder School for Students of the Urantia book. He has been tracking and analyzing typographical issues in the text of the book for many years, and is a member of the Standard Reference Text Committee. Merritt has authored at least two other books that I know of, The Call of the Spirit and the Urantia book Part 4, Jesus' Healings, Parables, and Ministry. And we're here tonight to listen to him tell us about his soon-to-be-released book, The Life and Teachings of Jesus, a harmony of the Urantia narrative and the four Gospels. I'm going to paraphrase something at the beginning of his longer introduction. The harmony is designed to make plain the nature and extent of the relationships between the gospel narratives and part 4 of the Urantia book. And it does so both in terms of form and content, or as I think of it, in terms of story and the telling of the story. That is, the language used to tell that story. At some point, Merritt, I will be interested in knowing what the most significant things you learned are about the similarities and differences between the gospel narratives and the UB narrative, and what surprised you the most. But for now, I'm simply going to turn it over to you.
Okay. Well, thank you. Dwayne, by the way, I don't know who wrote that second thing. That isn't actually, I don't know who, somebody's posted something wrong.
Well, I got it off some website.
Well, you know how it is. That's great. Thank you very much, though.
I also found Merritt Horn, by the way, who played football for some high school in Philadelphia, I think, in the 1890s.
Yeah, that's not me. I'm the guy who fell down in front of the entire stadium in like 19, when the heck was it, for the Penn relays. You know, one of those guys in the relay managed to fall down in front of everybody, and so my time there was not all that great.
Oh, that's funny.
Isn't one thing, it's another.
What were you, do you remember what you were running? What kind of relay it was? Was it
was
a
a mile
mile
relay.
relay or?
Mile relay. Yep. Yeah.
Oh yeah, well that's
Yeah, well,
that
that's
ain't you're not alone with that. I guarantee it, Merritt. You know,
yeah.
much as I've seen.
Oh my. Well, let me see. This is the first time, as I was telling Dwayne, it's the first time I've done a presentation trying to get all this into, an hour and then some questions kind of thing. So it's not going to be organized the way we want exactly, but let's see what happens here. Okay. So the what we've got is first, I'll bring this up. Is this interesting? Sure. If ever you don't see something you think you ought to be seeing, like if I put up a share or something, which is just, okay, there you ought to be seeing just a more than meets the eye thing. If ever you're not seeing something, let me know, because I've been known to be talking on for some time, and people are not looking at what they're supposed to be seeing. So anyway, as Dwayne may have alluded to here, this whole project goes back like 30 years. And it began when I was working on the first edition of the Fellowship Urantia book. And I first started noting some, well, it was one of these, well, that's interesting, you know, some things about the language in the book that I'd just taken for granted for a number of years. And over the course of working on the project, it's gone from, oh, well, that's interesting to, oh my gosh, what is going on here? So I just want to walk through a little bit since, you know, you guys, all of you, I'm sure, have memorized that email that Dwayne sent out. But even so, it's hard to imagine. I realize in going through that, it's hard to imagine, okay, what are we actually looking at? And so I've got a lot of just layout and stuff like this so you can see what we're talking about and thereby put it into perspective. The book itself is, at the moment, 2 volumes like this. It's like 900 pages. Basically because it includes all of part 4, as well as all of the Gospels. And that's just, you know, I mean, even in the Urantia book, that's 700 pages or so in part 4. Eventually, when we publish it properly on Bible paper, it'll fit into a single volume. But for right now, it's pretty large. And so I've also done it temporarily in PDF, which is what we'll be looking at, just so that people can see it and comment on it, that kind of a thing, before we actually put a whole lot of money into publishing it. So one of the first things I wanted to mention is that this is designed to be a reading copy of part 4. It's not designed to be, you know, just something you stick on your shelf and, oh, I'll go look up where is Matthew 6 in, you know, the Urantia book or something like that. It's designed so that you want to sit down and read part 4, use this, it's all there, and then you'll be able to see when and where the Gospels come up and how they come up and how the interaction works and all of that. The book also includes the Gospels as a narrative as well. In the back is part 2 of each one, so that you can read the Gospel and see how that's structured. And when there's a cross-reference, you can look at that. I'll show you that in a second. But in any case, I really think its best use over the years is going to be reading and then kind of stumbling into it and seeing, okay, here's how it is, rather than just going and looking something up, because generally we don't know where things are in the first place. So I want to, let's see, is that going to do the first thing? I'm sure we don't need to read this, but remember in paper 121, where the midwayers go through, this is in the tail end of it, where they talk about, well, here, as far as possible, they've endeavored to utilize human records. And especially, you know, although we've enjoyed access to the lost record of the Apostle Andrew and have benefited from the collaboration of a vast host of celestial beings, it has been our purpose also to make use of the so-called Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And then this goes, you know, I've edited a little bit kind of thing. But, you know, and he served more as an editor and a collator. You know, this is all in a couple of paragraphs there. And I know if you're anything like me, when you read those and you read the book, you think, oh yeah, the stories are in there. I'm sure they've used these a little bit, and, you know, they've told all the same stories or a lot of the same stories, and that's what they're talking about. And in fact, it's quite a bit more than that. And that's what the surprise was for me, and I think for other people who take a look at this. So I wanted to just, orient here a little bit. We've got a few hands here, I can see. You know, how much do you think that of the Gospels are in the Urantia book, kind of thing? You know, 10%, 20% of the Gospels, you know, 30% kind of thing. Anybody have a guess? 25 or less, 50 or less, more than 50%,
50.
50? That's a good guess. I probably would have guessed something like that. We'll see. We'll look at that in a second. And then generally, on thinking back, you guys have all been reading the book for a while. Do you feel like the book and the Gospels generally agree or disagree? You know, is this, they putting them in there and it's always for contrast, that kind of a thing, or not? You know, in line with that, this next question, you know, have you ever heard a Urantia reader or more than one feel like because of fundamentalism and because of the Paul's atonement doctrine and all, it would almost be easier to bring the Urantia book to Muslims or Hindus or Buddhists, anybody but Christians, because there's so much of a problem there. Anybody heard that kind of a thing before?
Mm-hmm.
Well,
Right.
no. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Well, I was surprised to find some of these statistics
There were.
as I went through them here. Let me bring, you guys can still see that okay, right? Or did I make it disappear?
Yes.
You can still see. Okay, good, because I moved things around. Okay, so these are rough counts, and they're just meant to be, you know, illustrative. Of the 3,779 verses in the Gospels, only about 150 aren't referred to or used in the Urantia book. That's about 95%.
Wow.
Okay. Now, some of them are simply referred to and not used, but the great majority of those are used. So there's, and then on the Urantia book side, you know, there's 570 some sections. 285 of those have a link to the Gospels, which is about 50% of all the papers that aren't concerned with the childhood or something like that. And it's about, if you remove those, it's like 60%. So we just don't see it going by, but there's well over half the sections in part 4 of the Urantia book have something of the Gospels in them, and over 95% of the Gospels are represented by in part 4. Now, in this work, all 100% of the Gospels are in here, but some of them are, I'll probably show you some. Some of them aren't connected and they just say there's no parallel text, but there's very little of that kind of thing. Let's see. Oh, and just about that atonement thing, you know, if you're like most of us, or most, you know, you feel like the atonement doctrine is just everywhere, and how can we possibly talk to Bible people about it? Forgive me saying Bible people. But the word atonement, which I know is not the only time it comes up, but just for the heck of it, that word's only found 5 times in part 4. 5 times, and yet it overwhelms everything that we tend to think about when we're thinking of, you know, what Christianity got wrong with the message of Jesus and this and that and the other thing. The part 4, as you get into it, is not about refuting that or correcting anything like that. It's telling the story of Jesus's life, and he didn't talk about atonement. You know, Paul's the only one who really does, and it's not in the Gospels. If we focus on the Gospels, we're focusing, whether it's in the Bible or it's the way that the Urantia book shows it. Sorry here. So to accomplish what I'm trying to do here, let me get this. What I needed to do, of course, was to start with a good text. To, you know, all along when I had this sense of that there's more going on here than people think, than I know, but talking about it isn't the way to go. We've got to show what's happening, and so that's why we needed the text had to be in good shape, and we needed some kind of a format to do this so it'd be effective, and it's not just me sitting around telling people, by the way, this thing's really close, or that kind of a thing. You know, it needed to just lay out there. Mike, did you have a question?
Well, It had to do with the atonement. Can we ask questions, or would you rather?
A little bit, yeah, as long as we don't break it up.
Okay,
We'll have
well,
plenty of time at the
I didn't
end.
know the protocol,
It's
so
okay. Mike
excuse my
never behaves
familiarity.
anyway in study group, everybody, so this is par for the course. Don't you worry about it. Yeah, just keep a note, Mike. We'll have plenty of time at the end, unless I
Okay.
just talk.
All right. The question was, I've already started this. The question is that Stephen Finland, now I mentioned his name Sunday, he has done at least, he wrote one book on it, but quite a bit on the atonement doctrine and in its relationship. Now that you've shown this, I don't know how much of a relationship he'd shown to in reference to the Urantia book. I don't know, but
Well,
are you familiar with his
yes,
books?
not yes. I'm not by any means an expert on it, and he's a biblical scholar than I am. He's focusing on Christian theology. Okay, and he's right. That is where Christian theology is heavily focused. That sets up
Right.
our whole relationship. What's our relationship with Jesus? What's our relationship with the church? What's your relationship with God? All of that on Paul's part is related to the whole concept of the atonement. But if you stick to the Gospels, you don't find it there. I mean, it is there here and there. There's no question that it's crept in here and there, but it's not the main point. You Paul doesn't really talk about Jesus's life. The Gospels don't really talk about after his death. I mean, they kind of end with the resurrection and
Yeah.
or with the ascension, and Paul kind of begins there. He only says basically two things about Jesus's life. He tells us about the just a couple of sentences about the Last Supper, which is in fact the first record we have of the Last Supper because he was writing very early. And then he gives us a little bit of information about his post-resurrection appearances, some of which is unique. And for instance, he's the only one who says that Jesus appeared to James, that he appeared to Peter first and then the apostles, that he appeared to the 500. He doesn't mention the lake, but that's the only place you find that, which is interesting. And again, he's the very earliest of the writers. So
Yeah. Yeah.
it's an interesting thing. Anyway,
Okay.
so that's
Anyway, well, thank you. Thanks
yeah,
for answering that.
yeah.
I got you.
Steve's
I'll
a
shut
great
up.
scholar, and he's working on something a little different, a different project, but he's really good. Okay,
Got you. Got you.
so the challenge here then, the real challenge was doing the Bible text, and I won't be able to do too much. It would be unwise to spend a whole lot of time on how I did this, but basically, the what you can see is that the revelators worked from an existing translation. They worked from the King James tradition, and which goes, I don't know how many are kind of familiar with it, but basically it's all the English Bibles up until the King James, and then you've got Tyndale back in the 1520s, the several other books, but the main one is the Geneva Bible in 1560. Then you've got the King James in 1611, and then there's a revision of that in 1881, and then an American version of that revision in 1901. That 1901 version is called the American Standard Version, and that was the most recent edition, if you will, revision of the King James that existed when the Urantia book was written. And what you'll be able to see is that's where the revelators started. Okay, and then they modernized. That version is still full of a lot of the early forms. Cometh, goeth. Ye, this, that. A lot of the primitive, or not primitive, but the early Middle English verb forms and pronouns. Unto this, that, and the other. Where pronouns are and prepositions are used a little differently. We can understand them, but they're not the way the Urantia book writes, certainly. You know, one thing about the Urantia book is you look at it, it doesn't have any of that stuff. But you can see by going through that that's what they modernized that. And just the last point on this is that you'll also find that the Revised Standard version, which is a revision of that American Standard from 1901, is probably the closest to the Urantia book version there is. Okay, it's also a revision in that tradition. It came out in 1946, the New Testament. And of course, the Urantia book was published in 1955, but the Urantia book was written 35 or so for part 4. And the Revised Standard project didn't begin until 37, 38. So they're very closely related, but the Urantia book is not dependent on it. It didn't exist until after the Urantia book, part 4 was written. So anyway, so what I've done here, we'll go along here. Okay, first of all, I want to give you an idea of what the book looks like inside. Okay, let me switch here to okay, with any luck you're looking at a table of contents, right? Page 1 of a table of contents. Okay, so let's see, 2 there. Okay, is that reasonably legible? Okay, so this is in the table of contents of the book. It shows both, you know, the standard table of contents of the Urantia book, you know, for part 4, and as you can start to see here, the cross references into Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And that's done the way any Bible parallel is done, you know, where you've got a storyline, usually Matthew or something, and then the rest of them are cross-referenced into it. Where does, you know, Luke tell the story? Does Mark tell the story? Where is it John? This kind of a thing. The wonderful thing about the Urantia book is that it includes all of this and it orders all of it. It tells you here's what happened in what order in Jesus's life. The issue has always been with the Gospels themselves is that while they the order agrees in most places, they kind of follows Mark, but there's lots of issues, disagreements. They're not, you know, contradictions. They're just okay, what happened when? And did this really happen then? Are these 2 separate incidents? Or are they the same one? You know, there are many times when Jesus says similar things at 2 different times. We know that from the Urantia book. And sometimes, so if they're both recorded in the Gospels, but in slightly different settings, you don't know, was this the same time, same incident recorded differently, or is it 2 different incidents? That kind of a thing. The Urantia book allows us to order that and to make, therefore, gospel harmony that is, well, very clear and helpful. There's lots of gospel harmonies that are great. It's not that this contradicts terribly, but it's the only one that can actually organize everything in a consistent timeline. You couldn't, of course, prove this by the Gospels, but it does make sense of the Gospels. And that's what you'll find that the Urantia book does throughout. So this is kind of a main cross-reference table of contents to the rest of the book and to the parallels. Then let me just show you here. This is what the book looks like when there's no gospel stuff. You know, there's nothing in there. In paper 120, for instance, is just a standard running part 4, right? And of course, paper 120, 121, they're almost meant to go to 122. You know, they just keep going. They're pretty much the same. When we get to 122, let me see if I can back this off. Is that still sort of legible when it's smaller like that?
Yeah.
Okay. Here again, you don't have this intro in the Gospels, But as we move just a little further along to, okay, Gabriel appearing to Elizabeth, for instance, now Luke has a lot to say about that. And so this is how the book is organized when that happens. You've got the Urantia book on the left and whatever gospel material there is on the right. There's always 4 columns for the gospels, but quite often 2, 3 are empty, or maybe they're all full. There are really very few instances where all 4 gospels are talking. John typically tells another story entirely. There's only a couple of overlaps. So generally it's 2 or 3. Now, there's very little, this is the Magnificat when Mary says how excited she, that's a terrible way of putting it. Anyway, that's not in the Urantia book. But, you know, Gabriel's announcement to Mary, there's a few more things. When we get to, okay, there's this, okay. And I know this is slightly confusing. Give me a break here. Okay, when we get to the presentation of the temples, where we first start to see more of the format here, I wanted to, if we just lay out the stories next to each other, it's easy to miss what's going on. You can see it's telling the same thing, sort of, kind of, but you can't always see the really close relationship between the texts. And so what I've done is I highlight, I bold, put in bold type, wherever the language is effectively the same. Now, there are some exceptions to that, but basically, when the language is the same, they're bolded. And here, as a good for instance, you can see that. Okay, this is the song of Simeon in the Bible. The first part of it is by Zacharias instead of Simeon, and then it just is. It's virtually identical in the Urantia book. There's the second part of it. Okay, so there's like 2 or 3 words that are not identical with the King James tradition here. Now, I don't want to push it too hard and say, and none of the other translations agree. This is translated in a fairly straightforward and similar manner in most modern translations. Okay? But nonetheless, to find this kind of identity doesn't happen unless the author is working from the other work.
Yeah.
So anyway, and then let me just go on, take this down a little bit. So that's how throughout the work this is organized. It also has, as you can see, cross references to, okay, where was the verse in front of this one? Where is the verse that follows this? You can see here that Luke 1 and 2 are intermixed a bit. This can happen quite a bit, and using the Urantia book to straighten it out or to organize it gives you something you'd never get by reading the gospel, but it nonetheless works. So let me just go down a little further, and it's the end of the thing, and then you get the story of Herod. There's another convention that I have, and that's this italic type. And that simply means that that verse or phrase or short passage is found in more than one place in the harmony. I do that as little as possible, but sometimes a story is just in the wrong place. In this case, Herod and the wise men in Matthew isn't quite here where it belongs it's not exactly where we would have it, but I want to show it in context, and so it's in italics, and that just shows you, okay, it's someplace else. The main reason that I do that, aside, I want to always make it possible for you to find a gospel passage in its original context. If it's just an isolated sentence or two, I want to make sure that someplace else you can see it in its context. And there are a number of well-known phrases that are part of the Gospels, the laborer is worthy of his hire, go and tell all nations, whatever it might be. that sometimes they're just not said by the Urantia book exactly where they might be in the gospel. And the last thing I want people to think is, if it's not there, that the Urantia book doesn't say it, right? Or if the gospel, it doesn't appear to be in the gospel right there, well, shoot, you mean the gospel doesn't say that, Jesus loves us or something? It may not seem to make sense, but there are things that can jump out at you very oddly. Then I want to make sure they don't. So as necessary, I've made sure that, I tried to locate them where you might expect. The other part then of the, so this is how the Urantia book part, I'll show you some more examples. These are not this shows you how I do it, right? Then I'm going to show you how the Gospels are laid out, just so you've got them. And here, they're a little different in parts 1 and 2, in volume 1 and 2. In volume 1, that's this one, it's just the Gospel narrative in the revision that I've created, this harmonized standard version, okay, which is exactly what you find out in the text. When you're running across the Bible text out back there in paper 122 or paper 140 or whatever, this is the text that you're seeing. And as you can see, where out here in the margin, it tells you where that section is in the Urantia book. So as you go through, you can track where the stories occur all the way through. And this allows, I think it's important even for I have no doubt the Urantia book students are going to be the first people to use this, not people who are first, Bible readers. But even Urantia book readers, and most importantly, Urantia book readers should learn how the Gospels run in their own context. Where is this story in the Gospels? How does it relate forward and backward? I've got directional pointers in the other part of the text, but here you can actually sit down, okay, where's the story, the story about John and what's connected to it, what's before it, what's after it, how does he use it here? And the only way to do that is to simply be able to read it this way. That's one of the weaknesses that's always existed in gospel parallels. Just on their own, you can see the parallels together like you see here in the rest of the book, but you lose, well, wait a minute, what was Mark trying to do something different than Luke here? Is the story in a different place? You've got numbers, but it's really hard to see exactly. It's hard to read each one of the authors as their own author without this kind of a text. And so I've included it to make sure that you can do that. Over in the other, see here, is it this one? There. Over here in volume 2, I have 2 versions here. Basically, sorry about that. I hope I'm not making you dizzy. Over here are 2 versions, the American Standard Version and the Harmonized Standard Version. The point of this whole thing is to show the work behind the creation of the gospel version in here, because I don't want people to think that I just made it up, that all the similarities you see in language and stuff like that is just because Merritt made it that way. He knew what he was going for, and so he did it. This shows the work, and basically you can see the American Standard, you can compare it to the Harmonized Standard, and you can see too, and I'll go in a little bit here, wherever I have used I'm not sure this is really a good one, but you can see here in verse 5, for instance, and there went out unto him all the country of Judea and all they of Jerusalem, and they were baptized of him in the river Jordan. Over here, it's and all the country of Judea, and those of Jerusalem went out to him, etc. You can see maybe these little G's here, and there are K's and things like that. That's showing where I got that language from another version of the Gospels, from another translation. G here is indicating from the Geneva version. K is directly from the King James. And this, again, is a practice similar to any Bible revisers. You know, any of these guys who work in the King James tradition, they see some things they want to change, but they always reach back into the tradition to see, well, wait a minute, here I'm working with the, you know, this American Standard. I don't really like it. I modernized the verbs, but is there a better way of expressing this back in the tradition? Okay, and so they look back there before they create something new. And that's what I've done as well. And, you know, you'll find many times I'm going back not just to the King James, but back to 1560. And there are many occasions when Tyndale, bless his heart, said it best. You know, back in 1525. I mean, it's huge. Tyndale is the basis for almost everything in the King James tradition anyway. But there are times when his phraseology is better than anything that's been changed since, or is, in any case, where the Urantia book phraseology comes from. So I've made clear to mark that whenever it comes along, and then in the notes for each one of the Gospels in this version, every time there's one of those extracts or one of those notes in here with that verse, this happens to be the Matthew notes. Okay, here's what the Geneva verse is, you know, so that you can actually go back and see exactly, okay, he says he got it from the Geneva version. What did the Geneva version say? Here's what it said. And the same thing for all the others. So that in this way, you can actually go back and see exactly where these came from, whatever modifications I've made. And you can also see things that, you know, that I did do, you know, that I just was not happy with what the American Standard had done. None of the things in the earlier versions were getting there. And so I've done my own adaptation. But I did try to make it a rule that if I had to come up with phraseology, that I did not just use the Urantia books. I tried very hard not to use the Urantia book phraseology if it was me coming up with a phrase, because I didn't want to get in a position where it looked like I was just making this stuff up. Our time is just, I'm talking too much here. Let me just pull up a couple of fun things here that start to get to language. Okay, we've talked about the stories, how 95% of the stories are in the Urantia book, but I haven't really, and I've talked about how, you know, and the language is that the Urantia book, we have to remember that the revelators could have written part 4 any way they wanted to. Right? Even relying on the Gospels, they could have gone in there and said, okay, let's go back. We're going to listen to what Jesus said in the Aramaic. You know, they've got that on tape, right? Or they were there. They don't need to have it on tape. And we're just going to do an English translation. Or let's go back to the Greek anyway, and we'll make a new translation from the Greek. Or we're just going to tell the story. You know, it needs modification. We're just going to tell the story. But in fact, and they did some of that everywhere, no doubt. But at every opportunity, when they could, they used the very language of the King James tradition. And that is to me, is a real flag as to what they're trying to do, trying to connect with the tradition itself, and giving us a way to also connect with the tradition. I mean, effectively, they're speaking in the very language of the Bible, not just telling the same stories, not just giving the same message, not just correcting things. They are talking in the same language that the Gospels themselves are known in. Now, here's just as an example, and I just like 2 of these before we jump around and just look at some other interesting things. This is the story of, part of the story of Jairus' daughter. I know you guys have all memorized that. You don't need any correction from me. Remember, this is where Jairus, the leader of the synagogue, comes to Jesus and says, please come, heal my daughter. She's at death's door, right? And he gets there and tries to go in, and the servants come out and say, hey, don't bother the master because she's already dead. And he says then, out of the house, you mourners, she's not dead, she's only sleeping. And they go in, and he raises her not from the dead, but from a coma. Well, here's how the story is told. This is just to give an idea of how the traditions connect. Can you see this fairly well? Is it large enough?
Yeah.
I put in the Greek here just because it's fun. Okay, but this is the underlying Greek. All right, but here is the Revised Standard, which remember was done at the same time as the Urantia book. I think of them as cousins. They both had the same grandfather, the American Standard Version, but they had different translation committees. Okay, that's the parents. So they really are cousins, and they really look that way. Anyway, here's a good basic translation of what that Greek is saying. He said to them, the child is not dead, but sleeping, and they laughed at him. Okay, but back in the King James, it said, he saith unto them, the damsel is not dead, but sleepeth, and they laughed him to scorn. Perfectly good early modern English, but not the way we'd put it. So we certainly wouldn't expect the Urantia book to say that, but it does. He told the mourners the damsel was not dead, but they laughed him to scorn. Now, that's a great translation, but there is no reason to use that unless you're trying to make the cultural connection somehow. You're trying to tie into that emotional energy in some way, because there's just, again, there's no reason to do that. It's beautiful, but anyway, that's for you to think about. Then here is another good one. The Samaritan woman at the well. Again, we all know that. And the same thing here. You can read the Greek. Phil, I'm sure you're up to your Greek and you can read it. But we'll start with the Revised Standard for everybody else. This is when Jesus says, I have water that of which you don't know, and if you would only drink this water, you'd have life everlasting, sort of thing. And the woman said to him, Sir, give me this water that I may not thirst, nor come here to draw. That's a really good translation of the Greek. The King James is similar, but, it's got some old verb forms. The woman saith unto him, Sir, give me this water that I thirst not, neither come hither to draw. Nice early modern English there. Well, it's interesting that those two revisions I told you about from 1881 and 1901 took advantage of a number of discoveries about the Greek text over those 300 years. And so they modified their translation just a little bit. There was only part of a verb form, but basically this is what they came to. The woman saith unto him, Sir, give me this water that I thirst not, neither come all the way hither to draw. They are adding that all the way hither. Well, gee, and the Urantia book says, Nalda then said, Give me this water that I thirst not, neither come all the way hither to draw. Great early modern English, right out of the tradition, and following along as the tradition modifies. And as I mentioned in here, the core of this still goes back to 1525, but to actually see the interchanging, and this is why in doing this revision, it was important to go back into the tradition to see, well, as these latest versions, are they really the best ones, or can we, find something better? What did the Urantia book do? Let's see, okay, we'll do just a teeny bit more here. I want to show you where, this is probably a real good one here. There are a number of times when the Urantia book, you have the same story, and the Urantia book with like one sentence clarifies something. Doesn't contradict the story, just clarifies something, makes it, oh, okay, this helps. For instance, 1, 2, 3, let me go back over here. And forgive me for having to look around here, but I just got to do that. So here we are. Jesus is talking about prayer. And and this is in the context of the friend and 3 loaves, right? We all know that story. Friend, lend me 3 loaves, please. And the Urantia book tells that story in almost exactly the same language, simply expanded a little bit. But what's interesting is what it says just a little before and in the middle. Prayer is the breath of the soul and should lead you to be persistent in your attempt to ascertain the Father's will. And further, if persistence will win favors from mortal man, how much more will your persistence in the Spirit win the bread of life for you from the hands of a willing Father in heaven? The story is the same in the Gospels, but it doesn't have that explanation. It just says, I say to you, ask and it shall be received. It goes from, your friend won't rise because he's your friend, but because you won't let him alone. He'll finally get up, and therefore ask and you'll receive, seek and you'll find. You don't get this sense of, wait a minute, how is God like this guy? And it doesn't make the point that persistence is the point in changing you. There's a further, if we go down just a little further to the story here of the unjust judge, which is in the same discourse. And try not to make it jump here. Protect me from my adversary, right? The woman is saying, please, unjust judge, protect me from my adversary. And even though the judge feared not God nor regarded man, he went along with her because she wouldn't leave him alone. And in the Bible it says, and the Lord says, hear what the unrighteous judge said, and will not God give justice to his elect, who cry to him day and night, though he bears long with them? I say to you, he will give them justice quickly. Okay. Not a bad conclusion, but it basically sounds like if you pray to him long enough, he'll change his mind. Jesus' conclusion to the story: these stories I tell you to encourage you to persist in praying and not to intimate that your petitions will change the just and righteous Father above. Your persistence isn't to win favor with God, but to change you, basically. And so you have just these, and there are just any number of points throughout the Gospels where one sentence to try to clarify what Jesus was doing is all that's needed to, we don't change God, we're trying to change ourselves. What's the point of persistence? The one on riches, for instance, is a good one. In the Bible, who can be saved. Here, let me just run this one real quick. Sorry, 163, where am I? I know this is confusing. Like I say, it's the first time I've done this, but I'm hoping to give you some sense of what the Urantia book is doing. So here, Jesus is saying how difficult it is. It's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to go into heaven. All that whole dialogue. And over in and in both cases, in the Gospels, over here, as well as in the Urantia book, Peter says, who then, Lord, can be saved? Right? Over in the Gospels, he says, well, with men it's impossible, but with God, he can do it. And basically, that's exactly the same thing it says in each one. Over here, yes, he does say that. much that's impossible with man is possible with God. But in the middle, he says, Peter asks, who then can be saved? Shall all who have riches be kept out of the kingdom? And Jesus replies, no, Peter, but all who put their trust in riches shall hardly enter into the spiritual life that leads to eternal progress. And it just enough. It makes it go, okay, it's not the wealth. Remember, it's the love of wealth. And it seems like a small thing, but it's been a forgive me if I were to overstate this, but it's been a real stumbling block for Christians in interpreting this. And what should our relationship to riches be? Is it okay to have money? Not okay to have money? Should we all be poor? Can the wealthy go to heaven? All of this because of an accurate story, which is missing just a little bit. No, it's not that the rich can't go to heaven, but they need to focus on what comes first. And so, even there's a bunch more examples, but I won't go into them. We'll move to right now. They're just over and over and over again in these uses of the Gospels or clarification of the Gospels. You find that the story is affirmed that's in the Gospels, but just as we always will say, yeah, but the Urantia book clarifies it or gives it context or gives a little more depth or this. Yes, it does all of that. And here's part of how it does that by very small additions to the story that allow one to simply say, if asked about it, if you will, by, a confused Christian, well, what if, it gives us an answer if we know this stuff well enough. We don't have to talk around and say, well, Jesus didn't really mean that. He meant this and that. One can actually speak the language of the Bible in going back. Well, he did say this, and what if? Do you think maybe he meant this? That kind of a thing. And Phil, I'm sure you've done this all the time. But having this in front of you, or being able to get to it, really makes it clear how they're doing it and what they're suggesting. And even though, as you can see, the words, almost all of the words in all of these Gospels is found over in the Urantia book. What it's doing, though, is it expands it. You can see directly how it expands each one of these stories. What does it add? Does it leave something out? In almost all cases, no, it adds stuff. There are a few cases where it fixes a misattribution. If you're from the worst possible case of this is in when the woman in Tyre, remember when they go to visit Tyre and this woman down the street has a Karushka, I think it is, has a very sick daughter. She wants Jesus to heal her daughter. She comes down and the apostles try to drive her away, because Jesus is resting, don't come over here. And it's just an awful thing where, in the end, in the Bible, Jesus says it's not right for me to take the food that's meant for the chosen family and give it to the dogs, implying, of course, that the Gentiles, this Gentile dog here, shouldn't get the teachings, shouldn't benefit from the teachings, from his life-saving work. Well, interestingly, the Urantia book, as you know, actually tells the story the same way, except it's Simon Zelotes who says that. Well, all of a sudden, it makes, you understand this firebrand of a guy, this is right in character. It was said, it's just misattributed. And while you can't go back and to somebody who follows the Bible and say, well, that's just wrong, and look at, the Urantia book says thus. But one can certainly start off, well, what if? What if that's one of the apostles? What if this? And, it really, I think, starts to make a difference. In the end, I think that we're knowing this well enough allows us to engage in conversation and rely on Jesus. What Christian, when are confused or has a difficult concept, and maybe it's Pauline or not, if we know and can go in and say, well, when I've thought about this, I rely on Jesus. And here's what he said. And here's what I think he meant when he said. And we know exactly what we can say back because we know it's the same that they thought. And it's even in the same language, and just enables us to, when necessary, I think, even deal with, various Pauline issues and stuff. If we know the Bible well enough to be able, and how it intersects with the Urantia book and the message of the book, to be able to say, well, I rely on Jesus, always, always. And here's what I think, And I think, again, what they've done is enabled us to do that much more effectively than, well, certainly than I ever thought. So I'm going to see if I'm going to really stop right there. But this is, I do want to switch to just this to remind us to what the revelator's purpose, the time is ripe to witness the figurative resurrection of the human Jesus from his burial tomb amidst the theological traditions and religious dogmas of 19 centuries. Jesus of Nazareth must not be longer sacrificed to even the splendid concept of the glorified Christ. What a transcendent service if through this revelation the Son of Man should be recovered from the tomb of traditional theology and presented as the living Jesus to the church that bears his name. They've given us these tools in a much more powerful form than I ever imagined. By giving us the language, by using all of that territory, and if we know it, if we know what's in there and learn to make use of it, I think that I think it'll make a big difference in how well the Urantia revelation can interact with Christianity and the success, if you will, we can have in the Christian world. And I think it's right there. We're still going to have to learn how to use the tools, but I think there are many more tools there than we thought. Because of this closeness of the language, it can only mean that they're trying to point us that way. The only reason to have that language in there is for the cultural, historical, emotional connection that it brings, and that's meant to be both a signal, make use of this, and in itself a tool so that we can make use of it. So I think I'm going to stop right there and we can have some questions. If you have any questions, and then plus you can tell me, well, this wasn't the least bit clear. Go, what the heck did you mean?
I want to thank you, Merritt. That's really, enthralling. That whole issue of intent was something that was always, in the forefront of my mind. And it reminds me, and we talked about this earlier. It reminds me of what the authors of the book tell us about Jesus's methodology in talking with others about their points of view. They would share their ideas about God, and he would focus on that kernel of truth in what they had to say and magnify that. It seems to me that the authors, in taking the tact that they did, are wanting to affirm whenever they can.
Mm-hmm. I think it's exactly so. They've shown us, they've told us how Jesus worked. Of course, they show it to us all through his life, and then they give us the tools to do that as well. You don't have to take, I know that there's always exceptions and difficulties and this and that and the other thing, but nonetheless, I think this gives us the tools to build out, to emphasize the truth. If we know the truth is shared, the key is to know the truth is shared And I hope that this work will help make it possible for people who aren't the scholars that, Phil, you and other people, Stephen or whatever, you don't have to be a phenomenal scholar of the Bible and the Urantia book to be able to put that together. I hope. And I hope even for them it'll make it a little easier. Yeah.
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
An observation, I had no idea that we were at 95% on the cross-referencing. But it bears out an experience I had when I first got the Urantia book. I had dropped out of religion back when I was 13, 14, and stopped reading the Bible and have never gone back to read it at all, even to today. And what I discovered once I got the book is I tried to go back to the church, and I would go to the adult Sunday school classes. And an observation I made was I knew the Jesus story better than the adult Sunday school classes. And I'm going, where did I learn all that stuff? So without knowing it, I picked up on all these things that you just referenced. And my not final, but my last comment is, did you use Dwayne Paw's book at all to help you?
Well, yes, I did. His was important. I'd done early work on my own before I ever saw that, but certainly in terms of making sure I'd hit the bases that needed to be hit, I made sure that I used his work. It's a remarkable thing. I didn't always agree with him here and there, I mean, nobody's perfect, and I know he wouldn't agree with me in many cases, but mainly, of course, I was trying to do something different. He's bringing in it's all numbered. I mean, if you're all familiar with the paramony, the rest of you, it's numerical, it's all numerical cross references, and it's completely thorough. The thing is, it's more quote based than story based. I mean, the cross references, I try to always tie them to incidents. Okay, when did he say this? And that's where I put it. Whereas with Dwayne's, of course, he's trying to, if Jesus said thus and so, he's going to put every cross reference there is in the Bible to that. And then, which is very helpful if that's what you're trying to do, but it makes it very hard to follow the story through the Gospels if with all this other chatter going on. So I think he accomplished his purpose well.
I would agree with that. I bought his book, but I never really used it. It was really overwhelming, whereas your approach looks highly useful, and hopefully we can get a hold of your copy even now. I don't know what it would take to do that, but I could see that it would be way more useful to me than trying to work with people.
Yeah, well, and that said, here, I'll show you something real quick here. That said, at the back end of the book, I'm still working on the appendices and stuff, but one of the one that's back there right now is a full numerical cross-reference of the Gospels, just a straight, where do you find this verse, kind of thing, that's much more similar to his. Well, it isn't similar to his work. It's just to support this so that you don't have to read through the Gospel to find if you know what you're looking for, you can use this. And I want to add some additional material to make it faster to get where you're trying to go. But the main thing, I think, is just that this is, the whole thing, I try to make it incident-based. And that way you can follow the story. And that's why it's nowhere near as thorough in a way as the paramony is. I can't show you every place that Jesus said thus and so. He said it lots of places. If I do that, then the story gets lost. But hopefully the important things get covered. And, well, that's the key. You try to, each thing has a different purpose. But anyway, so that's in there. And I'm planning to also do a cross-reference that's more the table of contents, has the organization and the Urantia book short references for the various incidents. I want to see if I can put together a meaningful and helpful one as an index that does that with stories that are simply by their gospel names and more in their order, because there's lots of stuff, of course, in the first part there that doesn't necessarily mean anything to somebody who's more familiar with the gospel. They can find it if they go this way and that, but I'd like to have it so that you could just simply look by biblical incident as well. So that's going. At the moment, no, this isn't available. This is available to people who will use it and give me comment back. I can make I've made a few and can make more hard copies, and then I can supply, PDFs like these for people who will, okay, I'm going to use this and see, do I have any comments? It'd be a whole lot better if this, or especially in the introduction material, this is, I'm not following you here. What are you trying to get at? Because in the end, it's like the introductory materials were harder to write in a way than a huge portion of the rest of the book, trying to get this whole thing. What am I trying to do here? It's sort of like what I'm trying to do in this conversation. And it just was proved to be difficult. But
Mike has a question, I think.
Well,
Yeah.
it's just you're telling the story and associating it with the Bible verses. Now, I am not a very intelligent person, but to me, that's what you're doing, and that would bring, it seemed to me, more fluidity to utilizing it.
Mhm.
If you want to get on a storyline and stay on the storyline,
Mm-hmm.
you could do that easier than Mr. Fall's book.
Huh.
I've never even seen his
No,
book.
it's quite impressive, especially given when he did it and the kind of data resources that were available. I mean, they just weren't. It's incredible. So,
Well, I'm not. I've got. Am I right in saying saying that yours is more in line of
well,
telling
yeah,
a story? It's like reading part 4.
that's what it is. It's reading part 4 with the Bible cross references in there so that you can see. And so it also organizes the Gospels. Again, if you spent any time in Bible studies or Gospel Studies 101 in college or something, you know how hard it is to make use of a gospel parallel. I mean, people have done tremendous work. I mean, the amount of work that's gone into them and the scholarship is incredible. But because of the very nature of the Gospels, it's hard to, well, when did this really happen? Did it really happen? Are these two incidents? Is this one incident? Did he tell the same parable in 2 different places? Did he, and how on earth do we fit John in here? Because John has, I think, 2 things in common with it. The feeding of the 5,000 and the cleansing of the temple are like the only things he has in common with everybody else. Where do we fit all his stuff? Yeah. And by being able to do that, again, this isn't an act. You can't go with the Urantia book having done something like this and go to a biblical guy and say, see, this is, here's this is supported by the Gospels kind of thing. It's not an academic work. As you've noticed, when the Urantia book says something, it doesn't say, and according to this and going from this, a kind of an academic argument, never does that. It just says, here's what happened. Well, as far as the alignment with what can it do then in academia, it's really just like a novelization of the historical Jesus. But that can have a great value too. And what I think, to my observation, what's amazing is that while you could never derive the Urantia book story from the Gospels, in other words, the academic direction, you could never go that way. But starting with the Urantia book, it supports and endorses, reinforces more of the Gospels than any other work there is.
One of the things that Dwayne had told me was that the Urantia book, and he was an incredible biblical scholar, but that the Urantia book really, really helped him understand the Bible better. And then in my own experience on how I would use your work is I would start with the gospel lesson. I'm talking about Sunday school class, but I would interject the insights of the Urantia book. I would not start with the Urantia book. I would start with the gospel and go to the enlarged insight. Now, without consciously thinking about it, when I was attending adult Bible schools, I would often get in trouble because I remember one incident in particular. I was in the class, there were about 10 or 12 adults in there. A question was asked, and based on the Urantia book, I had an answer, but I sat there and didn't offer it. And I looked around the room and nobody was offering an answer. So I spoke up and I offered the answer. Oh my Lord, they jumped all over me. Now, what was interesting was about 10 weeks later, I was same class, another question was asked, and the woman who jumped over me the most gave my answer. It was not in my words, but it was my answer. And I looked around the room and every head was nodding. And I went, talk about planting a seed and that rare occasion where you see it bloom. It was an amazing experience. I don't have that often, very often. But to use your work, I would use it, quote, backwards. Because when I was attending church, I never ever mentioned the Urantia book. I would go in there, I would add an insight, and I was always monitoring, was it too much of an insight? And I would go from there. But it would be fun to take your work and go the opposite direction when working with the Sunday school class.
No, I think that's exactly how it could be used. I mean, you build out the truth, right? Start with the truth and allow, that Jesus' technique. You allow the truth to overcome the error eventually. My dad taught Bible study for years and years and years and years and years in the Ozarks. Fundamentalist. It was not the most conservative congregation in the county, but they're all conservative, and that's what he did over and over and over, and trying to work in the Urantia book and figure. I know he'd love to have this, because you can read the gospel story. Okay, now and it doesn't have to be, of course, well, what if? I think maybe he was trying to get at this or this or there's all kinds of ways to go after it. What's amazing in the end is that the Urantia book does give us a real, consistent, deep, thorough personality. The problem with almost any other interpretive life of Jesus, and that's why it's so hard to do, or any just, a strictly academic trying to solve the problem with historical Jesus, is they almost always come across as caricatures. Because there's only, they have to pick and choose in order to come up with a story that works. And this is done sincerely and very thoroughly. It's very hard to get a Jesus with any depth. Well, is he an apocalyptic prophet? In which case, okay, these things work, but all this other stuff must have been put in by, early Christians, and this certainly can't be true. And you end up then with a very shallow, he's this prophet who looked just like John the Baptist and who died because of his political differences with Rome, kind of thing, or whatever it may be. And whereas the Urantia book story gives you a full-blooded person, really has depth and complexity and all, without negating huge sections of the Gospels. That's what's incredible, is it doesn't do what every other life of Jesus or interpretation of the Gospel does, which is go through and really do a heavy-duty editing on what must be, what we can count on as being real, what probably isn't real, this, that, and the other thing, and you end up with a small selection of gospel verses and a very, like I say, almost a caricature of Jesus. And that's despite all the work. That the problem is, that's what the Gospels provide. They aren't a good basis for biography. I mean, not because
You remind me of how President Jefferson edited the Bible, and wherever he saw something he didn't like, he just deleted it.
Yeah, God, he went any of the miracles or anything like that. He turned Jesus into an ethical guide, which of course, yeah, he was. But then now you've just turned him into just a philosopher, which was not what he was. And it really, and again, that's why I say, while the Urantia book could never pass as an academic work in the sense of you could get this, here's my what I've done from the Gospels, and this is the story I get, but going the other way, it is indeed, it supports and validates more of the Gospels than anybody else's version of who Jesus is than there is, because it doesn't pick and choose. The few things it leaves out or, just ignores are very small for the most part. And quite often it says, well, this is what happened, but they're not particularly important. I mean, some of them are not believable by anybody, like Jesus is cursing the fig tree, well, sure, he might have cursed the fig tree, but in one of the Gospels, I don't remember if it's Matthew or Mark, the story is, well, and he went by, he was hungry, he wanted to go to the fig tree, but it wasn't the season for figs. So he cursed the fig tree. I mean, it's just this, what? It cannot be real. And so, yeah, that's not in the Urantia book. But it does some interesting things with other things as well. But I think that seeing this and realizing what a resource we have to work with the Christians to reinforce what they already know, already believe strongly, compellingly. We don't have to sell them on Jesus. What we don't want to be doing is taking Jesus away because he, pulling him away with the atonement doctrine and saying, you guys got it all wrong. Here's who Jesus was, and we just don't have to do that at all. Because really, the number of atonement doctrine things that are in the Gospels are very few and far between. They're almost always added sentences at the end of some narrative, and a sentence gets thrown in about, dying for our sins or something. There aren't many of them, but the ones that there are just that kind of a throwaway line. So
the typical approach taken by many scholars is just always struck me as being both short-sighted and just plain arrogant. They assume certain things about the life 2,000 years ago in Palestine. The ignorant fisherman wouldn't have ever had a chance to attend rabbinical schools or anything like that. And the Urantia book tells us that all except the twins, the Alpheus twins, had gone through some training in the scriptures.
Yeah, and the explanation is perfectly reasonable, but you couldn't get it out of the Gospels because the Gospels just give you the Pharisees side of it. These guys were uneducated, And so, yeah, I mean, how do you build on that? There have been, of course, people will have said, well, maybe he knew some Greek, this and that, or maybe, they lived in this area. They couldn't prove he didn't, but, or that he spoke Greek and several other languages fluently, but there isn't the support for it in the Gospels. So, it's the old, well, what's the most probable thing? The historian having to get in there. Well, we can't say that this had to be true, but it's certainly the most likely thing is he was as ignorant as they said, and that none of them could have written the Gospels and all that kind of stuff. So, but the Urantia book even backs up the traditional version of the origin of the Gospels. We kind of take it for granted. Well, Matthew wrote first in Aramaic, or he, and then that was taken by Isidore, who wrote it in Greek, and that Mark spoke for Peter, and Luke for Paul, and here's when the circumstances and when they wrote. Well, what few of us not studied know, that's the very traditional version of it, and it goes all the way back to the Papias around the year 110, who was probably an associate of John, not his amanuensis, but who probably was a hearer of John, and his story, he tells that story, that Matthew wrote originally in Hebrew or whatever, and people interpreted it as they could, and then before it was written into Greek, and that Mark wrote, Peter's version of this. And it's just amazing how it's going in there and reinforcing a number of the very traditional stories in the Gospels, which no modern academic would do. They can't say it didn't happen, but there really isn't any other support except for this one guy back around the year 100 saying it, and it's recorded in one other place, and so there's just so many different things. So anyway, well, I don't have. I think it looks to me like we're all falling over. So anyway, I will let Dwayne will know when we move to the next stage here of this thing. Nick, if you'd like to get a PDF of this for your own use in the meantime, let me know, and Dwayne will send me your email address or something. Looks
Well,
like
I would be interested, but not if it's going to cause any hassles.
no, the PDF's easy. The printed ones,
Okay.
I'm happy to. I mean, I don't really like the PDF. It needs to be in printed form to really see it.
Oh, I agree with you completely on that.
But at this point, the number, I mean, they're all handmade, but without the skill you'd want from a handmade book. So,
I would also take while I'm only just becoming familiar with your project, I would take a closer look at it. One of the things, and this is raising a major point, I have a narrow view of ChatGPT. I find it's got a lot of problems when you work with it. But I also found I was working with the Global Endeavor. And
I've heard of it, but I'm not familiar at all.
Neil.
Oh, is that Neil Waldrop?
Yeah, his
Yeah.
project. And it's a rather pretentious project where he wants to provide indirectly support for people or organizations that are doing stuff that parallel what we would like to do. And they created a report. It was like 58 pages. And I'm trying to read this thing. It was impossible. So I loaded it into ChatGPT and said, what the hell does this thing say?
I've
Believe
read
me.
parts of that too, Nick, and I've said the same thing. I said, I can't make heads or tails of this.
Well, the thing was within a second, Chat, I call it Chat for short, comes back with a 3-page summary, and based on having laboriously plowed through this tome, had to agree, by God, it summarized this thing in 3 pages, way better than the whole darn report did.
That's great. Hey, you want to hear a cautionary tale, though? Here's the funniest thing. It just happened. We just had Zoom has an AI that will summarize stuff, and it generally does a real good job. Okay, well, I'm going to stop this recording here. Just